So the second phase of Yeats's poetic career, which runs from really the very early 20th century up until roughly the end of World War One, is what I'll call his conversational phase. Why? Well, in the Romantic phase, we see highly musical language. There's an ornateness to the language. There's an intricate artifice to the language. There's a sense that we get as we get when we say read Tennyson that this is poetry italicized. There is no effort to capture how people actually talk. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree and the small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. No one would talk that way. But what happened? Yeats just kind of outgrew his youthful romanticism, as people often do. He also read the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who ultimately teaches that the world is a place of tragedy. And only when we acknowledge that can we find any kind of joy. We must embrace our fate in this brutal material world. We must love it. We must say yes to it. We must say that I would will to live my life all over again with all of its pain. Only when we do this, Nietzsche calls this idea the amor fati, love of fate. Only when we do this can we find any joy in life. So that's one idea he got from Nietzsche that really spoke to him. So in his verse, he attempted to try to take a more honest look at how the world really is and embrace how the world really is without looking at the world as it really is and trying to get out of it. And part of this shift is not only in perspective, but also in how he wanted to write about the world. So he went for a poetic form that was more casual, more conversational. He often imagined an interlocutor, like say in a dramatic monologue. So there's something much more open to the give and play, the give and take, I should say, the give and take between opposites, between myself and my interlocutor, say. So there are two views that are equally valuable, or just the idea that one converses with the world. One faces the world as it is and attempts to negotiate the world on its own terms. A perfect example of this conversational phase, as I'm calling it, is Yeats's poem Adam's Curse. Now, of course, the title gives it away. He's saying, I'm going to write about the fallen world. From the Christian point of view, after Adam eats from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he is cursed. He's thrown out of Eden along with Eve, and he is cursed to labor and toil for his food, and he's cursed ultimately to die. Paradise is no more. So here we see Yeats sitting with two friends, probably based on Maud Gunn, a beautiful Irish revolutionary that Yeats was in love with his whole life, but she never would marry him, and another friend, Kathleen Pilcher. And here, listen to this language and contrast it with the language in the Lake Isle of Innisfree. We sat together at one summer's end, that beautiful, mild woman, your close friend, and you and I, and talked of poetry. I said, a line will take us hours maybe, yet if it does seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement, or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world. So he's saying writing poetry is hard. Writing poetry is very hard. It's harder than any kind of manual labor you can imagine. To get a line that to sound just right, you have to work harder than someone cleaning floors for a living. But even though you work so hard, society sees you as if you're an idler. Society sees you as someone who's not really worth taking seriously because you spend all your time trying to create art that no one really cares about. And he continues and responding to something one of the women says. It's certain there's no fine thing since Adam's fall but needs much laboring. There have been lovers who thought love should be so much compounded of high courtesy that they would sigh and quote with learned looks precedents out of beautiful old books. Yet now it seems an idle trade enough. There again, what does it mean that we are fallen, that we have to work for everything? There's no such thing as poetic inspiration. There's no muse going to come on your shoulder and whisper song into your ear. You have to be almost, again, like a kind of manual laborer or a craftsman. And that's difficult. We sat grown quiet at the name of love, he continues. We saw the last embers of the daylight die, and in the trembling blue-green of the sky, a moon, worn as if it had been a shell, washed by time's waters as they rose and fell about the stars and broke in days and years. So look at that. The moon here is not this rich symbol of imagination. The moon here is not tied to the beautiful dreams of Fergus. The moon is worn as if it had been a shell washed by time's waters. So the moon here is not romantic. It's a realistic moon, and it's not really beautiful to behold. It's not really hopeful to behold. And the poem ends this way. I had a thought for no one's but your ears, probably referring to Maud Gonne, the woman Yeats was in love with, that you were beautiful and that I strove to love you in the old high way of love, in the romantic way, the way of poetry, the way of courtesy, the way of courtliness, the way of nobility. I strove to love you in the old high way of love, that it had all seemed happy, and yet we'd grown as weary-hearted as that hollow moon. So what does art do in this poem? Nothing. It's something that one engages in with great diligence, but that society does not value. And after talking about the difficulty of poetry and its inconsequentiality, one looks to the moon for some kind of hope and strength. Nothing. It's pale and tired. And then that leads the speaker to think, well, I feel like that moon. I feel tired as well. I feel hollow. I feel weary. So we can say that this poem expresses a kind of psychological realism, utterly lacking in the more romantic poems like Lake Olive Innisfree. But there's an honesty here, yes, and there's a maturity here as well. And even though the poem ends with this kind of cynical note, it's ultimately an affirmative poem because we see this man talking to these two women with pleasure, with depth, with richness, with intelligence. So even though the subject matter of the conversation is not necessarily positive, there is a sense of community and a sense of mature, thoughtful people striving together to understand their place in this painful, somewhat stupid, weary world. So there's another poem from this time, a short poem called, from this period, the conversational period I'm calling it, called The Fascination with What's Difficult. Yeats was very active in literary societies, very active in Irish theater. In fact, for a time, he was the manager of Abbey Theatre in Ireland. So he had to hire carpenters, he had to cast plays, he had to pay people. So he couldn't live the retired life of the artist, the Fergus-like poet anymore. He had to engage with the world. And this poem, in praise of the fascination of what's difficult, grows out of that experience of managing Abbey Theatre. The fascination of what's difficult has dried the sap out of my veins and rent spontaneous joy and natural content out of my heart. There's something ails our colt that must as if it had not holy blood, nor on Olympus leaped from cloud to cloud, shiver under the lash, strain, sweat, and jolt, as though it dragged road metal. My curse on plays that have been set up in 50 ways, on the day's war with every knave and dolt, their theater business, management of men. I swear before the dawn comes round again, I'll find the stable and pull out the bolt. So this is just a more brazen utterance of disappointment about how difficult it is to manage the everyday world. So I think I'll stop there with these poems, the conversational poems. And in the next talk, I'll move on to speak of what I'm going to call Yeats's mythological phase, when instead of just sort of settling for the difficulty of life and trying to reconcile to it, he tries to create these kind of grandiose mythological structures that will ultimately claim for art something much more powerful than what he claimed for art back in his romantic phase. If in his romantic phase he saw art as a potential escape from the terror, from the difficulties of history, in his mythological phase he says that art can engage with the horrors of history and make sense of the horrors of history and allow us to find solace, not by looking the other way, but by looking straight at. So we'll get to that next time.